the role of monetary and fiscal policies of the Japanese government in Japanese economic growth and other related phenomena. Secondly, I have written a Japanese model of political economy with a question mark, with the Y missing. That part was unintended. The question mark is there for a reason. I'm not convinced, and I think some of you probably are not convinced, that there is some unique Japanese model of political economy. But we do need to consider the proposition quite seriously, given the almost unique performance of Japan among the industrialized countries of the world today. So let me start with the general issue of the role of the government in Japan through its monetary and fiscal policies. The general view seems to be that the corporate tax system in Japan stimulated investment, as I discussed in one of my lectures before. Secondly, people also agree that the monetary policy followed by the Bank of Japan favored growth. When it comes to fiscal policy, which has to do with government expenditure and taxation other than corporate tax system, the corporate tax system is part of the fiscal policy, but that part is not controversial. The controversial aspect seems to be really the principle of balanced budget that Japan has also followed more or less during this period, prompted initially actually by its post-war US economic advisors. This principle of balanced budget, some people argue, actually has led to increased saving, but the econometric evidence for this is rather weak, and the theoretical issues are very muddled. A second view, which claims that this has been too rigid in managing aggregate demand, has a number of adherents, and also in terms of the actual history of Japanese fiscal policy, it's a good question whether the budget really always has been balanced in the sense that conservative economists would define balanced budget. It might have looked balanced from an accounting sense, but the kind of expenditures the government engaged in, the kind of tax policies that it implemented, might well have led to quite a bit of influence on the aggregate demand in a rather discretionary manner. Now, when I say discretionary manner, I mean that the government is not locked up in a rule. It can use discretion. It can vary the size and the components of the government budget in order to affect the economy. It is important to actually look at the evaluation of the role of the government in the Japanese economy if the second question, Japanese model of political economy, is to have any validity at all, because what seems to be at least partly unique about the Japanese case is that government intervention has been a rather remarkable kind of feature, which has led not to the kind of bad effects that people in this country might imagine, but actually has made Japan more competitive and more prosperous than other countries of the world. So I want to approach the issue of the role of the government in this context with the ultimate aim of examining the second question, the question of whether there is a unique Japanese model of political economy or not. There is a very good study available in a book called Economic Growth. It's published from Yale University Economic Growth Center, which has done a lot of early work on Japan It's edited by Klein and Okawa. Lawrence Klein is a Nobel Prize winning economist from University of Pennsylvania who implemented many of the early ideas of econometrics in building macroeconomic models. He, along with the Dutch economist Jan Tinbergen, is responsible for making most of empirical macroeconomic work, especially in the Keynesian context, possible. The modern conservative economists have raised many theoretical issues and many questions about the validity of much of this work. And some of it is quite interesting. Without getting into those complications, which if any of you is interested, you can pursue during the discussion, let me just mention a feature of American influence in Japan that's not always recognized. And this influence has to do with the influence of a group of economists trained at University of Pennsylvania by Lawrence Klein. These economists were trained in early 50s and 60s. And they went back to Japan, and now they are in fairly influential positions within the government and in many autonomous and semi-autonomous research organizations. And they are doing very, very good quantitative work, which the US economists have stopped doing, it seems. And they are doing this very usefully because it is being used. And the best work in this tradition actually would make one somewhat optimistic about the relevance of economics and the economists. A very good article in this book, edited by Klein and Okawa, is the one by Shuntaro Shishido, who, when he wrote the article, was a researcher in the Japanese government. Since then, he has moved on to the new university in the science city of Tsukuba. The science city is also a very interesting Japanese concept, where you have a concentration of technocrats as well as research and university facilities. Soviet Union has been one of the early imitators of this Japanese concept. Shiseido has very carefully evaluated the post-war experience of Japanese growth and the role of government policy in this growth. He concludes that in case of Japan, first of all, fiscal policy is conducted with a very small-sized budget. The budget itself is not very large. The tax revenues are also very low. So you have a small budget with small tax revenue. If you want to balance it, typically you'd have to spend as much as you take in, so government expenditures will also have to be low. Therefore, predictably, the government expenditure turns out to be an extremely low proportion of current expenditure in the GNP. There is also a lag between public investment and fast economic growth. Public investment has grown less fast or more slowly than the economic growth figures for Japan as a whole. Fiscal policy, for the most part, has been either neutral or sometimes had a tendency towards deficit in the government balance. So we must ask the question, if the government fiscal policy by itself led to any kind of significant increase in the growth rate, because on the face of it, the answer seems to be no, it really didn't lead to very much of an effect at all. In order to do this, we can resort to something that the economists quite often do, which I find actually a most intriguing kind of thing in economics. The only discipline which has done this successfully before is physics and Einstein is the most famous person for proposing this kind of experiments. These are called thought experiments. Some experiment that you cannot do in real life, but you can do in your head. So let's do this thought experiment together. Let us ask ourselves the question, had the Japanese experienced a higher tax burden and greater government current expenditure, as in Europe, say, what would have been the effect on the growth rate? So this is a thought experiment. Sometimes it's also called technically by philosophers of science as a counterfactual experiment. What didn't happen in reality, but we are asking what would have happened if certain things were different. Well, one reason why I still believe in modeling is because without models, it's very difficult to do this kind of thought experiments. Okay. You can turn and twist the facts as much as you want in your head till your head is ready to burst open. You really won't get anywhere unless you have a set of relationships in your mind that can be changed, or some variables in those set of relationships that can be changed in your head. So you need a model that is written down as a set of equations, and those equations can be manipulated. Well, this was fundamentally the contribution of Lawrence Klein and the econometricians who worked with him at the University of Pennsylvania. What Klein's students did after going back to Japan was to build several different models, and we can use one such model to answer this question and to do this thought experiment. This is the medium-term macro model. Medium-term means anywhere between 5 to 15 years. And macro model means that you don't look at every individual and every firm in society, in Japanese economy individually, but rather you look at broad economic aggregates like saving, investment, growth of GNP, employment, etc., etc. This particular model has 42 equations. If you're anxious, thinking of the possibility that I will now begin to write down each one of those 42 equations and lead you through this, you can rest easily, because I'm not going to do that. The data that has been used in trying to answer this question is semi-annual data, that is 2 observations per year, from 1954 to 1964, which is a decade of observations. So there are 20 observations for each variable in the equations. And based on this, we can run some simulation. So we can replicate alternate realities, as it were. Things that didn't happen but could have happened if other things were different. So what could have happened? Well, according to the simulation results that are thrown up by this model, we find that effect of higher rates of personal tax, social security contribution, and indirect taxes would lead to deflationary pressure throughout the economy. GNP will be reduced by 4.88 trillion yen at the exchange rate of 1964. You can convert this to dollars. It won't be a lot of dollars because the exchange rate of dollar for yen was a lot more yen then than it is today. Growth rate would fall from 9.8% to 7.4%. The component of expenditure that would be most readily affected is the private fixed investment. So we find here that investment is not just related to rate of interest, it's also related to overall economic activity. Other results that follow are results we would expect with any kind of knowledge of macroeconomics at all. Because of the reduction in GNP and growth rate, there is a reduction of imports. This leads to an enormous trade surplus for the Japanese economy. So you probably wouldn't wish Japan to have done that, because even without these policies, it has an enormous trade surplus. Secondly, it would also lead to an increase in government surplus. That's understandable. If you have just higher taxes, etc., revenue would be higher. And thirdly, it would lead to unused or excess capacity, which means that there would be increased unemployment as well. Both capital and labor would be idle in Japan. So now you can see why Japan did not exactly follow these policies, because no one wants all these results together, especially the last few that I mentioned. However, if you follow the same pattern as public expenditures that West European countries followed, not the US, but the West European countries, where the defense expenditure was higher than Japan, but lower than the United States, where social security expenditures were higher than Japan, but lower than the United States, where there was more of a welfare state than either Japan or the United States, and still is, then it would indeed serve as an offsetting factor. So public expenditures would turn out to be fairly crucial for Japan. This turns out to be a very interesting and important policy issue for Japan right now. And that's one more reason why I wanted to take you through this model. So, what can we conclude? We can conclude that the adoption of European fiscal structure for Japan would tend to cause a lower share of private expenditure for both investment and consumption, and a higher share of public expenditures. Who would bear the burden? That's the economic question. Interestingly, there would be a corresponding tax burden on private business and households. At the same time, it will not significantly affect the overall growth rate and the net balance of the government, which, given the history, is good news for Japan. What else would happen? Interestingly, and this is an issue that I will come back to after I come back, because this is one reason why I became an economist. These policy measures would usually produce a more favorable effect on social welfare. And to be just very frank with you, that's the reason why I studied economics. I wanted to see what led to increased or decreased social welfare. And I want to spend at least one session after I come back discussing this in the particular case of Japan. Because all this growth, all these trade surpluses would mean nothing if the Japanese people did not benefit from it, or if some Japanese people benefited a lot, but a lot more Japanese people actually were hurt or did not benefit. These are the most interesting questions for me in economics. How will this social welfare be enhanced in Japan? It will be enhanced through increased expenses for social security, education, research, public health, etc. Finally, we also can conclude, using this model, that fiscal or monetary policy dealing with total demand by itself would not be able to deal with the issue of prices. If there is inflation in Japan as a result of increased government expenditure, then the best way to solve that would be to have some kind of deflationary policy. And this does pose a dilemma for the economist who wants to increase social welfare through the set of fiscal or monetary policies that I mentioned. In the coming period, the Japanese economists will increasingly come to grips with this problem and will increasingly have to decide how best to promote both growth and welfare in the Japanese economy. We will now move on to the issue of the Japanese model of political economy. Media such as film and video tend to compress time, which is probably an advantage on our side. But back in my amateur days of music and poetry and drama, I used to be part of a group that self-consciously called itself the Epic Theater Group. And part of the principle of epic theater is to constantly remind the audience that they are actually watching something artificial, and they should not confuse it with reality. So I should begin by mentioning that between the last segment and this, some time actually has elapsed, some real time. We went out for lunch, and I hope we all are suitably refreshed. And we also are switching to a somewhat different topic. The title, which is the title of the first essay of one of your books, consciously, The Japanese Model of Political Economy. And I want to discuss every word of this title during the course of this lecture. Murakami, who is the author of this article, starts out by distinguishing between two types of models. I will come back to what the meaning of the word model is in a minute. But he says there are two types of models. First of all, there are those models that emphasize economic factors. And secondly, there are those models that emphasize cultural factors. For example, there is an extensive literature on Japan, which is called Nihonjinran literature in Japanese. It's about the Japanese characteristics, Japanese mind, etc. Some of it's obviously nonsensical. For example, Japanese mind is just as non-existent as the American mind. There is no such thing. The philosophers actually have found a rather amusing name for this kind of mistake. They call this kind of mistake looking for Japanese mind or the American mind or the teenage psyche. Right? It's really like the search for Holy Grail. And philosophers have a better name for it. They call this kind of mistake metaphysical holism. So to assume things about the group that there is no way in the world anybody can verify or find out about. So the nice part about this is that it's holistic. The bad part about it is that it's metaphysical in the bad sense of the word. And when I think of this, I usually remember some lines from my favorite 19th century operas by Gilbert and Sullivan. In one of their operas, they have this young man who is dressed up very fancily and talks in the best Victorian tradition, small talk, cocktail party chatter that sometimes can be observed at the parlors in GSIS also. Well, Gilbert and Sullivan observe that meaning doesn't matter if it's only idle chatter of transcendental fancy. Now, sadly, I have to warn you that there is a lot of this kind of transcendental chatter in social sciences, especially in the political economy literature in general, and more specifically in the Japanese political economy literature. Japanese in the sense of not written by Japanese necessarily, but the kind of political economy that tries to investigate the political economic aspects of Japanese. And the more towards Japanese uniqueness it tends, the more absurd it usually becomes. And one can only observe, looking at some of these young scholars ruminating over such things in the same fashion as Gilbert and Sullivan did, how profoundly deep must this deep young man be? Now, the problem with this profound depth is that usually it's completely meaningless, and it doesn't leave us with any kind of illumination. I hasten to add that Murakami is not really that kind of a scholar. He does not make the kind of facile error that a lot of others have made in the field. So he begins by a distinction, not a very careful one, I must say, but a distinction nevertheless between two types of models. And he hems and haws and ends up saying that, well, there are models that emphasize economic factors. They're important. And then there are those that emphasize cultural factors, and most of them are rather absurd. But there is some kind of cultural factor that must be introduced. And then he has this rather abstract idea of model of political economy, where he draws diagrams of the economy and the polity and makes them intersect. If we haven't run out of paper, I will draw it for you. So Murakami's idea of political economy, if this diagram is any clue, is the following. He draws an ellipse and calls it the economy. He draws another ellipse and calls it polity. And then he has a number of environmental factors that are listed below, and there are supposed interactions, or at least effects of these environmental factors, which he actually divides in two categories. On the objective side, this is his word, he calls these objective factors. He includes physical environment, which I suppose really consists mainly of geography and technology. And then he has something called international environment, which, given the nature of our enterprise here, would be crucial. Then on the subjective side, he has national goals and cultural environment. Now clearly, no one can quarrel with classifying things in one way as opposed to some other way. The question one has to ask is, what relevance does it have? How does it enhance our understanding? Why should we put up with your distinctions rather than mine or somebody else's? And supposedly this will lead to greater illumination at the end of the essay, and so we should move on. But I want to observe, just in passing, that this kind of diagram of economy and polity as two separate things, and somehow finding an intersection and defining that as political economy, is probably not the best way of going about this business, because it really begs the very question that is under discussion. Because it really does not discuss political economy as an integral concept in itself, but rather introduces two separate concepts, economy and polity. And it's a good question as to whether they can be two separate concepts, and then somehow defines an intersection, which logically might be impossible to do, and then gives us a very smug and self-satisfied answer by pointing at that intersection, that that's where the political economy is. Now, if somebody in this room can actually show me that's where the political economy is, I will be very happy to buy this. But right now, I don't. But I want to, for the time being, go on with Murakami, because there is something that is genuinely valuable in his discussion and needs to be understood. A second reason for this excursion is that that essay is painfully tedious and boring to read. So before you give up in despair, I actually want to leave some sort of a trail for you which you can follow. And maybe then some of the things that seemed very tedious and boring on first reading would become more meaningful to you. Murakami begins by distinguishing between two concepts prevalent in Japanese sociological literature. One is the concept of ie, And the second concept is that of mura. Literally, ie is household and mura is village or hometown. Now, in sociological literature, however, they have somewhat more specific meaning, and that part of Murakami is actually quite valuable. So please don't throw the baby with the bathwater, as the saying goes, and take this part of Murakami quite seriously, because I think it is a serious kind of distinction to make in terms of what he calls the cultural environment of Japan. Let me just repeat for you from his essay how he draws the distinction between the two types of organizational patterns. In the EA type of organizational pattern, he uses EA as a genotype. Again, I want to draw an attention to some methodological problems with this essay. I think it's very facile with metaphors and analogies drawn from other sciences. Genotype has its proper use in evolutionary biology. To draw that out of evolutionary biology into sociology without explaining how it is being used actually is a violation of a very fundamental principle of conceptual thinking, that you cannot use concepts just out of context. Anyway, he goes on lightly to define the EA genotype as the tight version of the indigenous organizational principle. And it is a group that is supposed to have the following characteristics. First of all, this is an organization with a collective goal. Goals are not idiosyncratic goals of individuals, but they're collective. They are defined with respect to the group and not with respect to the individual necessarily. There is also a sort of motivating factor in this. The goal is supposed to extend and enhance the group. So there is a dynamic element in the organization. The membership qualifications, secondly, are defined as kintraktship, which is an anthropological concept. No member can leave the group once he or she joins it. So there are very strong kind of measures that can be taken against the groups who might consider leaving the group. So this is quite often observed by anthropologists in some tribal type of organizations. And it's interesting that in Japan, this form of organization historically evolved at a much more organized society and persists even to this day. Thirdly, there is the factor called hierarchy homogeneity balance by Murakami. It means, in his words, I quote, all members are organized in a hierarchy aiming at some functional goal, and various complementary measures further their homogeneity. So the hierarchy really has sort of a moving target of creating more and more homogeneity, which is quite interesting because when we think of hierarchy, we think of differentiation, people as being different. But since it's the group that is being reproduced and there are homogeneous elements within the group that define the group, these structures are not only reproduced, but over time actually are made more homogeneous, which is quite an interesting trick. Finally, there is autonomy. The group, separated from the society as it were, has all the functions in itself necessary to its perpetuation. Now, Murakami does not mention this, but a moment's reflection should show you that there really can't be any such self-perpetuating group in any society except for the most primitive type of society. Because if you take family, for example, it cannot perpetuate itself, let alone reproduce itself with greater degree of homogeneity without a larger economy and a larger polity in any kind of organized society, which is complex at all. So it's only a relative kind of autonomy that one has to think of when one thinks of autonomy. Now the Mura variant is defined as the loose version of the indigenous organizational principle, which is also a group. And this group is defined also as, first of all, having a collective goal. But this collective goal seems to be even longer term than the collective goal of EA. The membership rule is also the same as EA. All members should stay with the group for as long as the group continues. You can recall the lifetime employment system in Japan, which is not unique to Japan, but psychologically at least it has this dimension. People subjectively might reflect this principle at some level in their psyche. There is also a kind of homogeneous and hierarchy balance there, which is slightly different from EA, because members are supposed to be homogeneous, and therefore there is a kind of egalitarian principle. At the same time, there are all these delicate shades of ranking that reflect the functional capability of individuals. So your performance, which determines your place in the hierarchy, is related to how well you are viewed within the group by the other members of the group. And finally, there is less autonomy and a multifunctionality kind of aspect of Mura. Now, why Mura should be called more informal than EA is something I haven't figured out. I'm quite lost on this. But Murakami tends to think that Mura is a more informal organization than EA. All the characteristics that are mentioned do not in the least suggest, to me at least, that one is more informal than the others. Now, this objection I just made actually has rather grave implications for the originality of his essay that it claims for itself. Now, what does he do? Well, he tries to find models for the economy and models for the polity, and then he tries to find that area in between, the area of overlap. That's his methodology, pure and simple. So within the economy, he focuses on what he calls a sub-model explaining the firm behavior, much of which actually has already been covered during our session on the Japanese firm. The more interesting part is the section where he discusses a sub-model explaining administrative intervention in the Japanese economy. Finally, he has also a sub-model explaining market structure. And that's quite important too. Though what he has to say there, I would suggest, is quite trivial. His favorite way of dealing with the subject seems to be to propose some seemingly forbidding looking, or at least forbidding sounding, intellectual constructs. The whole essay is strewn with headings like this hypothesis or that hypothesis. Some hypotheses are numbered. Some hypotheses have qualifying phrases which are polysyllabic usually in front of them. And then there are some theorems. And theorems are numbered as they would be in a text of mathematics. All of which to me suggests that formally somebody here is striving after what he construes as scientific validity, or at least a scientific description. However, when one looks at the content and not just the form, one is increasingly dubious about, first of all, whether this is really science or sorcery, to be uncharitable. And secondly, even if it had some elements of science, whether they were actually defensible kind of propositions. And one can ask the further question, what kind of exercises would really be necessary to make this enterprise really scientific? Now, my position is that these subjects, or these matters, or these topics really allow scientific discussion and scientific elaboration and testing. However, the way it has been presented in this essay combines the worst of science with the worst of mysticism. So let's go to his economic model first. In the economic model part, first he discusses the Japanese management hypothesis. And I'll be fair to him, this is not a hypothesis that he has presented. There are other people in the literature who have bandied around this hypothesis and have made much of it, including the much vaunted theory Z, which tells you a lot less than the letter Z suggests, whatever it might suggest. Well, this hypothesis claims that the Japanese firm in the major post-war industries was a community-like organization. And this community-like organization aimed at internal expansion. Well, firms always aim at internal expansion. That's not unique to the Japanese or, the Ivory Coast firm or firms in the United States for that matter. Firms, if they don't expand, usually die. So there's nothing new about that. There's nothing Japanese about that. The hypothesis becomes more interesting when it makes the following claim. In terms of economic performance, the Japanese firm historically has sought to maximize its market share subject to a certain minimum profit rate. Now this is interesting because this contrasts with the conventional wisdom in economic theory, the standard theory of firm, which says firms maximize profit. But here it is claimed that firms don't maximize profit but market share. Now that's actually not an original insight on the part of these Japanologists, because the theories and results have existed in the industrial organization literature, in the US especially, for a long, long time, since the 50s and 60s. Where it becomes a little more interesting, but at the same time fuzzier, is in the claim that for this kind of performance, a certain kind of group consciousness is necessary. Masahiko Aoki, whom we have discussed before, actually has a fairly strong characterization of this that is non-mystical, and it is presented in the usual economic theoretical framework by considering utilities that managers of the firm might derive from their various actions. Personally, I object to a utilitarian framework, but it's a far, far better alternative than calling something group consciousness and leaving it at that. Because when you have named this something group consciousness, I know no more than I knew before. And in the worst applications of this kind of category, of which the present essay is clearly an example, it's nothing but the old metaphysical holism that we discussed at the beginning of this lecture.